In October 1979, 10 miles outside Chillicothe, Missouri, Clint Harmon stepped out of a 1972 Chevrolet C20 with 286,000 miles on the odometer and rust eaten through both rear fenders, and three men at the co-op scale house stopped talking long enough to watch him cross the gravel lot. His overalls were faded, almost white at the knees, one pocket stitched with heavy thread from an old seed sack, and his boots carried field mud that had dried in ridges from a morning spent checking fence around 42 cow-calf pairs. Behind him, on a gooseneck with chipped rails, sat an Oliver 165 O diesel with peeling green paint, a cracked seat, and front tires worn shallow at the lugs. It looked less like capital and more like memory. Around him, Livingston County was turning toward financed shine. New four-wheel drive units were arriving at $68,000 to $92,000, most on 11.75% notes, with monthly payments near $1,050 and annual equipment debt service above $24,000 before anyone bought fuel, seed, or hydraulic lines. Clint asked only for scale tickets and moisture printouts, folded them into a ledger, and drove home. The misjudgment was immediate, and it was social before it was financial. The coffee crowd called the Oliver Yard art. Two neighbors joked that his machine shed leaned harder each year because the tractor inside had forgotten how to pull. A dealer salesman, pressed shirt, polished belt buckle, clean logo cap, asked Clint whether he planned to farm or collect antiques. Clint gave him 4 words. "I plan to stay open." Then he left in the same old truck, window crank squeaking, heater fan clicking on the highest setting. What no one could see from the lot was that Clint was running a strict household budget of $9,840 per year, including groceries, electric service, clothing, fuel for the pickup, and church giving. He farmed 320 acres of corn and soybeans, kept the cow-calf pairs, and wrote one line in a ruled notebook every January, always in block letters. No borrowed money for depreciating iron. By the winter of 1983, his visible assets looked worse than in 1979, but his books showed $117,400 in retained earnings, 0 machinery debt, and cash reserves equal to 14 months of operating cost. Clint did not come to that rule from theory. He came to it from numbers and one hard memory. In 1968, when he was 20, he watched his father sign a note for a newer tractor and a pull-type combine package because everyone said scale required speed and speed required financing. The note opened at 8.25% variable, then climbed above 10% in less than 2 years. 2 weak crop seasons followed, corn under 95 bushels per acre on ground that had promised 120, and the family sold cows to keep current on payments that did not reduce principal fast enough. Clint learned a phrase early and never forgot it: payment current, equity shrinking. By 1972, interest had consumed more cash than repairs ever had. His father did not lose all the land, but he sold enough of it under pressure to change the family trajectory. Clint kept one image from that period: his mother at the kitchen table, making 3 columns on lined paper: seed, feed, note. The note column was always the tallest. That was the day he shifted from wanting newer equipment to wanting optionality. A machine could fail and be fixed. A note could reset and pull a whole operation downward at once. He began with work that did not require leverage. From 1973 through 1976, he worked days on a neighbor's hay operation and nights welding cracked wagons, replacing bearings, and re-sleeving hydraulic cylinders for small operators who could not afford dealership labor. He charged less than shop rate, usually parts plus $10 per hour, and saved almost everything. In 1973, he cleared $6,420 after taxes and living costs. In 1974, he cleared $8,310. In 1975, he cleared $9,080. In 1976, after a heavy hay season and 2 engine rebuild jobs, he cleared $11,240. Savings were not spectacular in any one year. The pattern was. In 1976, he bought the Oliver 165 O diesel for $4,900 cash from an estate sale north of Dawn, Missouri. The tractor had high hours and tired paint, but sound castings and a transmission that still held under load. He spent $740 on fluids, filters, belts, and rear wheel seals, and another $310 on injectors from a salvage yard. Total entry cost, $5,950. A comparable newer unit, at that time, would have required at least $9,000 down and payments above $430 per month. Clint calculated 7 years of those payments at more than $36,000 before interest adjustments and unplanned service. He wrote one note in the ledger margin: buy function, ignore paint. In 1977, he cash rented 160 acres at $52 per acre and planted a conservative rotation. In 1978, he added another 80 acres, same approach, no machinery note, no operating line beyond seasonal float, cleared by harvest. By 1979, he controlled 320 acres, still with the Oliver as primary power, and an older planter he had rebuilt 1 row unit at a time. The farm looked undercapitalized to anyone who judged by sheet metal. The book suggested the opposite. His year-by-year ledger from that early period explains the strategy better than any speech could. 1979. Gross farm receipts, $103,764. Total operating costs, $64,382. Household budget, $9,840. Below-line deductions for taxes, rent, true-ups, livestock carry costs, and capital improvements, $10,942. Retained earnings, $18,600. 1980. Gross, $111,920. Operating costs, $71,110. Household, $9,840. Below-line deductions, $9,670. Retained earnings, $21,300. 1981. Gross $119,440. Operating costs $76,700. Household $9,840. Below-line deductions $7,000. Retained earnings $25,900. 1982. Gross $108,300. Operating costs $71,760. Household $9,840. Below-line deductions $3,600. Retained earnings $23,100. 1983. Gross $122,160. Operating costs $73,820. Household $9,840. Below-line deductions $10,000. Retained earnings $28,500. 5-year retained total $117,400. Machinery debt service across all 5 years $0. Annual interest expense on equipment $0, $0, $0, $0, $0, $0. That same discipline mostly invisible in patched overall years, later positioned him to make a much larger public purchase with certified funds instead of signatures on financed paper. Clint's discipline was quiet, but it was not passive. He bought bearings in bulk when winter auctions turned thin and bidders stayed home. He purchased hoses by inside diameter and cut them himself to avoid emergency dealership pricing during planting week. He tracked fuel burn per acre by field, adjusted injector timing when consumption rose, and checked valve lash every off-season, whether the tractor seemed to need it or not. In 1981, he spent $1,120 on preventative parts and avoided an in-season breakdown that would have forced custom hire at $18 per acre across 170 corn acres and 150 soybean acres. Avoided custom bill, $5,760. Net savings, $4,640 after parts. Simple living was not an image choice. It was a cash flow design. Annual housing costs at near zero because he lived in a modest farmhouse, already paid for through family transfer terms completed in 1978. Property taxes and insurance were included in farm overhead. Food averaged $4,920 per year, clothing $420, utilities $1,860, pickup fuel and maintenance $1,440, church and community, giving $1,200. Total household spend, $9,840. He did not treat frugality as sacrifice. He treated it as retained optionality. By the second week of March 1984, when flyers for the Trenton Equipment Expo began showing up on rural mail routes, the county had already decided what Clint represented. To many, he was stubborn. To lenders, he was small. To sales staff, he was a delayed commission. Yet arithmetic was beginning to separate signal from noise. Clint entered that spring with no machinery notes, 14 months of operating cash, and an Oliver 165. Oh, that looked exhausted, but started every cold morning after one cycle on the manifold heater. The crowd saw rust. Clint saw paid-for horsepower. 4 days later, Clint drove that same Chevrolet C20 into Trenton for the March Equipment Expo, parked at the far edge of the gravel row, and walked past a line of polished tractors that gleamed like dealership promises. The truck looked rough, even by farm standards. Rust blistered along the rocker panels, tailgate chain replaced with baling wire, windshield cracked in one corner, and a hand-painted number on the door from a long-ago county fair pull. Clint wore the same faded overalls, patched at both knees with a brown work jacket whose zipper had been replaced with a brass one from a surplus bin. Wade Kessler stood 20 yards away in pressed khakis, white logo shirt, clean dealer cap, and boots with factory tread still visible. He greeted larger operators by first name and monthly payment range. When Clint asked for trade numbers on a four-wheel drive package, Wade glanced at the Oliver brochure Clint carried and laughed hard enough to draw attention from 3 nearby farmers leaning on a display planter. Wade did not lower his voice. He said that running that rusted Oliver into another season would put Clint out by harvest, then slid a printed quote across the counter with a pen tap at the financing line. Purchase price $172,400, down payment $18,600, annual percentage rate 13.2% variable, 84 monthly payments of $2,214, estimated total paid $204,576 before insurance and service plans. He framed it as a rescue plan. He asked whether Clint wanted to farm seriously or keep pretending. Clint read every line, folded the quote once, and placed it in his ledger. He thanked Wade for the numbers. Then he walked to the parts auction ring behind the main building and bought what he had come for: bearings, seals, injector tips, fuel line, manifold gasket set, one rebuilt injection pump core, hose stock, and two used rear wheel weights. Total $1,340. Cash. The clerk counted bills twice because almost no one paid auction parts tickets in full anymore. That walk from the finance desk to the auction ring looked small. It was not. It was the same decision Clint had made, in one form or another, since he was 20 years old, and watching interest eat through his family balance sheet faster than work could replace it. The root of that discipline was not fear of technology. It was fear of fragility disguised as progress. In 1968, his father signed a note package that seemed modest in spring and predatory by winter. Principal balance opened at $26,700 across machinery and carryover operating debt. Initial rate, 8.25% variable. First-year interest expense, $2,203. In year two, the rate stepped to 9.6%. Interest cost rose to $2,563 while commodity prices softened and weather narrowed margins. By year three, after two weaker yields, they were still making payments but reducing principal too slowly, and accumulated interest plus penalties crossed $7,400 over 36 months. Clint learned that current and healthy were not the same word. From 1969 through 1972, he tracked his father's note statements in a school notebook, line by line, not because anyone asked him to, but because numbers explained tensions adults refused to name. Payment due dates landed whether calves brought a premium or not. Replacement parts cost less than note service, yet notes took priority because missing one payment triggered calls that repair shops never made. The family sold cattle to satisfy the bank, then rented more acres to recover revenue, then stretched labor thinner, then saw repair bills rise because maintenance slipped under pressure. It was a loop. It looked like growth from the road. It felt like drowning at the kitchen table. Clint left with one practical doctrine by the mid-1970s. Debt on land could be rational if structure and price were favorable, but debt on depreciating machinery created a race against time, weather, and interest rate resets all at once. That doctrine hardened when he began welding and machine repair after his own field days. He saw what financing did to neighbors he respected. Men and women who worked harder than anyone in town still lost ground because cash outflow was fixed while income was not. Good operators, bad timing. One leverage decision in the wrong cycle. He converted that observation into arithmetic he could control. In 1973, he set a target savings rate of 38% of after-tax income. He finished the year at 34%. In 1974, target 40%, achieved 37%. In 1975, target 42%, achieved 41%. In 1976, target 45%, achieved 44%. Not perfect, consistent. He stopped evaluating purchases by sticker price and started evaluating them by months of optionality, meaning how many months he could keep planning if receipts collapsed. Every discretionary expense had to pass that test. By 1978, when family transfer terms gave him clear control of the farmhouse and core acres, he drafted the household cap that remained in place for years: $9,840 annual living spend, reviewed each January. It was specific by category because vague budgets collapse under stress. Groceries, $4,920. Utilities, $1,860. Clothing, $420. Pickup fuel and repairs $1,440, giving $1,200. No restaurant line item, no vacation account. He was not performing poverty. He was insulating working capital. Before we go any further, pay attention to this tension because it drives the entire story. If you judge competence by financed equipment, you will miss the operator who can withstand a bad decade and still help other families stay on their land. Clint understood that years before most of the county did. 3 days after the expo, he and his nephew rolled the Oliver into the shed, blocked the rear wheels, and opened the engine. They worked 6 nights in a row after field checks, heat lamps swinging overhead, parts laid on flattened feed sacks in firing order sequence. No shortcuts. Cylinder compression had slipped below threshold on 2 holes, injector spray pattern was uneven, and one seal showed clear leakage at operating temperature. Clint had expected that. He had budgeted for that. He had cash for that. What he did not have was any appetite for a 7-year payment plan based on a single optimistic yield forecast. Their rebuild costs tracked to the dollar in the ledger. Auction parts, $1,340. Machine shop cleanup and head check, $280. Fluids and filters, $146. Incidentals, $74. Total, $1,840. Comparable dealer overhaul, quote, $6,900 minimum, not including transport. New financed replacement package from Wade, $204,576 total scheduled outflow. The resulting comparison was stark. Clinton restored functional horsepower for 0.9% of the financed package outflow. The improvement was measurable, not sentimental. After injector and timing work, fuel use dropped from 6.3 gallons per engine hour to 5.6, an 11% reduction. On a projected 540 annual engine hours, that saved roughly 378 gallons per year. At $1.04 per gallon average farm diesel in that period, annual fuel savings were $393. More important, consistent starting and stable pull load reduced planting delays. In Clint's own calculations, one delayed planting day on his acreage could cut gross revenue by $2,400 to $4,800, depending on weather sequence. Reliability was yield protection. By late April 1984, he had shifted from repair bench back to field rhythm without adding a monthly payment. He bought seed with early cash discounts where available, accepting smaller lot flexibility in exchange for lower per-unit cost. Corn seed prepaid discount saved $612 across his order. Soybean seed timing and vendor split saved another $184. He purchased nitrogen in off-peak lots and stored within compliance, trimming per-acre nutrient cost by 7.6% compared with spring-posted rates. Every small margin looked trivial in isolation. In aggregate, those margins replaced borrowed money. His operating structure that year is worth slowing down for because this is where many good farms separated into 2 very different futures. Total planned crop acres remained 320. Corn yield assumption set deliberately low at 108 bushels per acre for planting, though normal ground could do better in favorable weather. Soybeans budgeted at 34 bushels per acre. Cattle revenue projected conservatively off 42 cow-calf pairs with a 91% wean rate assumption. Gross revenue budget, $116,900. Operating cost budget, $78,250, including fuel, seed, fertilizer, chemical, repairs, insurance, taxes, and rented labor bursts. Household draw fixed at $9,840. Planned retained earnings target, $20,000 plus. Contingency reserve entering season, 14 months of operating cost equivalent. Machinery debt service, 0. The counties still read him as undercapitalized. That misread widened because visible signals kept favoring financed optics. New cabs had radios, cold air, and spotless paint. Clint still carried a crescent wrench in his jacket and drove home in a truck that rattled above 50 miles per hour. Yet his break-even stress point was lower by design. He did not need record yields to stay solvent. He needed average weather, average discipline, and no panic decisions. At 2 local coffee counters, men repeated Wade's line that Clint was 1 season away from being forced into a trade. They were not cruel men. They were repeating the dominant model they had been sold for years. Modernize fast, scale fast, service debt through volume. The model worked in smooth periods. The trouble was that smooth periods never last. Clint did not argue in public. He did not offer speeches. He kept 1 folded page in the ledger from the Expo quote and wrote a note under it in pencil. Monthly payment buys pride first, risk second. Then he shut the book and went back to valve lash checks, fence repair, pasture rotation, and a machine that would be mocked all summer and still finish the season pulling straight. By harvest planning week that year, the Oliver had crossed 11,200 hours and was starting cleaner than it had in 3 seasons. The truck crossed 290,000 miles. The house budget remained fixed. The operating account remained positive. On paper, Clint still looked small. In resilience terms, he was preparing for a decade that would punish appearances and reward arithmetic. In January 1985, while other operators were waiting on lender renewals, Clint sat at his kitchen table with a sharpened pencil, 2 coffee rings on the ledger cover, and 1 new target line beneath his old rule. Retain 20 cents of every gross dollar before any expansion decision. He budgeted corn at 112 bushels per acre and soybeans at 33, both deliberately below optimistic county projections, then penciled calf receipts off a conservative 90% wean rate on the 42 pairs. His gross estimate came to $100,000 to $21,300. Operating costs, including fertilizer, chemical, fuel, crop insurance, repairs, property tax, and seasonal labor, were $80,420. Household draw stayed locked at $9,840. Planned retained earnings, $18,700. Machinery debt service, $0. By harvest close that year, he beat his own cautious plan without changing the spending cap. Actual gross reached $126,940, helped by a stronger soybean basis in November and lower fuel burn from the rebuilt Oliver. Operating cost finished at $79,760. Household remained $9,840. Taxes and minor capital work took $11,540. Retained earnings posted at $25,800. Net worth closed at $148,200. He moved $12,000 of that into a 12-month certificate at 8.1%. Not for excitement, but to keep idle cash from eroding and to force himself to preserve a reserve outside checking. In 1986, he repeated the same discipline with minor refinements that looked boring from the road and decisive in the books. He prepaid part of his seed order for a 3.5% discount, split nitrogen purchases between post-harvest and late winter to reduce exposure to spring spikes, and bought 2 used gravity wagons for $2,200 total, instead of financing 1 new wagon package priced at $9,400 plus interest. That season grossed $133,480. Operating costs rose to $84,360 with higher chemical pricing and tire replacement. Household still $9,840. Retained earnings $27,100. End of year net worth $221,900. The jump looked abrupt, but it came from cumulative retained cash, paid down rent obligations, and land value reappraisal on owned acres that had never been pledged as collateral. By the first week of March 1987, Clint had enough liquidity to do what he had promised himself for a decade. Buy ground only when it could be paid in full and still leave working reserves intact. He purchased 80 acres adjoining a field he already farmed, $72,000 cash, with closing costs of $2,430 and immediate fencing and tile repairs of $3,160. Total outlay, $77,590. Neighbors called it cautious to the point of waste, because finance buyers were controlling more acres faster. Clint viewed it as risk compression. On that 80-acre parcel, even an average rotation at 117 bushels corn and 35 soybeans, net of direct costs, would add roughly $11,200 annual contribution without any note payment claim. He could survive a weak year and still hold title. His ledger for the next 4 seasons carried the same rhythm, and this rhythm is the hidden engine of the entire county story. 1987. Gross receipts $142,760, operating costs $93,840, household $9,840, retained earnings $23,900, end net worth $309,400. 1988. Drought pressure. Cut yields hard. Gross $121,620. Operating costs $88,110. Household $9,840. Retained earnings $10,600. End net worth $296,700. 1989. Weather normalized. He bought 120 acres for $114,000 cash, plus $3,980 closing and legal, gross $167,340, operating costs $104,220, household $9,840, retained earnings $31,400, after land purchase reserves were rebuilt. End net worth $417,600. 1990, he paid $23,500 at pickup for a used John Deere 7720, combine with 3,100 separator hours, then spent $2,740 on chains, belts, and one unloading auger tube before first field use. Gross $173,880, operating costs $109,460, household $9,840, retained earnings $35,700, end net worth $486,900. The numbers mattered beyond pride because they changed his break-even structure. A neighbor carrying $24,000 to $31,000 in annual equipment debt service needed top half yields and favorable basis to remain current. Clint needed functional yields and disciplined costs. In 1991, when commodity prices whipsawed and lenders repriced risk, that difference became survival math. His interest expense on machinery remained exactly what it had always been: 0. His total interest expense across all obligations was limited to short timing floats that were cleared inside the crop year. He was not immune to bad markets. He was simply not forced to feed a fixed debt schedule during them. Let me stop here and ask you something. When pressure rises, which operator has more real freedom? The one with the newer cab or the one who can miss a market rally and still plant next spring without asking permission from a bank committee? By late summer 1991, Livingston County had an answer, and it did not flatter anyone. The operators who had expanded through variable rate borrowing were not reckless people. They were often the most hardworking and community-minded in the county. They attended school auctions, coached youth teams, and showed up with chainsaws after storms. Their mistake was structural, not moral. They accepted debt stacks that worked only if rates stayed tame and prices stayed cooperative. Then both moved against them. Darren Holt is the clearest case. In 1986, he assembled what looked like a rational growth package: 640 rented acres, 2 financed tractors, 1 combine note, and a land contract down payment. Total commitments of $412,000 across layered obligations. Initial blended rate was 9.5%. Annual debt service began near $54,600. Heavy but manageable in strong years. By 1990, resets and refinancing pushed portions of that stack toward 14.8%. Annual debt service climbed above $73,000 before accounting for repairs and rent escalators. 2 middling crop years and 1 weak basis season drained his operating line. He sold 1 tractor to reduce payments, then had to custom hire at higher cost. That margin squeeze finished the spiral. He lost the 640 rented acres over renewal cycles, not in one dramatic day, but contract by contract. Marie Bell and Tom Bell followed a similar conventional script with smaller scale and the same vulnerability. They carried 280 acres under a variable structure totaling $189,000, with expectations built around stable grain and gradual principal reduction. Their payment schedule assumed interest in the high single digits. When rates rose and input suppliers shortened terms, they faced months where cash outflow exceeded inflow even before family expenses. They trimmed living costs, sold a hay rig, and delayed repairs. Then a transmission failure on their primary tractor forced an emergency choice between planting timeliness and note current status. They kept the note current and missed planting windows. Their foreclosure filing came later, but the outcome was set in that decision. Javier Ruiz had built his operation around cattle margins and feed efficiencies that were realistic under ordinary input pricing. He financed expansion of his herd and feed handling equipment, believing throughput would outrun payments. Instead, feed costs rose, calf prices softened in the wrong quarter, and his combined debt service plus feed purchases exceeded gross receipts by $27,400 in one cycle. He liquidated much of the herd to stop the bleed, then spent 3 years rebuilding working capital from custom hay and contract labor. He was never irresponsible. He was overfixed at the wrong moment. Len Parker carried machinery loans through a period when everyone was told modern scale required modern iron. At auction, his equipment sold into a saturated used market. Sale proceeds cleared only 62 cents on each borrowed dollar. The remaining deficiency followed him for years. He moved from ownership into full-time mechanical work because it was the fastest route to stable cash and debt resolution. He was skilled enough to save other farms while losing his own balance sheet position. 3 days after Darren surrendered his last large lease block, Clint mailed rent checks on time, paid supplier balances within terms, and bought no celebratory equipment. There was no triumph in it for him. He had known these families for years. He had borrowed tools from them, traded labor at haytime, and sat beside them at sale barns. The county mood shifted from competitiveness to fatigue. The old jokes about yard art stopped. The broader crisis was multifaceted and relentless. Input costs climbed in steps, while grain prices moved in jolts. Credit committees that had encouraged expansion tightened covenants and required more collateral support. Variable rates repriced faster than most operators could adjust production plans. One poor weather sequence now interacted with higher debt service, not lower. A 12% drop in yield was no longer a bad year. It was a covenant event. In 1988, drought conditions cut county yields sharply, and cash rent terms did not fall in equal proportion. Cornfields that had budgeted near 120 bushels per acre finished far lower in too many places. Soybeans on thinner ground never filled. Insurance helped, but payments arrived after the bills that mattered most. Clint took yield damage, too. His corn average dropped, his soybean revenue tightened, and calf weights came in lighter on stressed pasture. Yet his operating structure absorbed the shock because he had no equipment note demanding a fixed monthly transfer regardless of weather. He reduced discretionary repairs, delayed one non-critical outbuilding project, and preserved planting capital. The following year brought rate pressure and inventory overhang in machinery markets. Dealers needed turnover and pushed trade cycles harder. Wade Kessler kept calling. He offered improved terms, then seasonal promotions, then deferred payment structures that moved principal forward. Clint declined each one, not with speeches, just with 2 lines in the ledger margin after each call. Payment is a weather forecast disguised as certainty. Keep cash where weather cannot seize it. By the second week of November 1991, the gap between appearance and resilience had become visible even to those who had dismissed him. Clint still drove the same Chevrolet, now with more rust along the wheel wells, and an odometer creeping past 320,000 miles. The Oliver still looked old, parked behind the leaning shed. Yet his books showed positive retained earnings through weak seasons, expanding owned acreage purchased with cash, and a machinery line item that carried repair costs instead of interest chains. He was not merely enduring the cycle. He was preserving optionality for the next one, and that would soon matter for more than his own farm. In December 1991, Clint closed the ledger on a year most people wanted to forget and opened a second notebook labeled liquidity, not growth. That distinction mattered. He still budgeted every acre and every calf, but he began tracking one additional measure each quarter, cash available after a full year of operating expense set aside. If that number stayed strong, he could move when stress hit the county again. If it dropped, he would stand still. By spring 1992, he held $186,000 in cash equivalents, split between local certificates, short treasury instruments, and a conservative money market account that never drew attention at the bank counter. 18 months later, the river spread over bottom ground in the 1993 flood cycle and turned ordinary planning into triage. Many farms were hit unevenly, but every operator faced the same non-trivial tension. Bills arrived on date, yields arrived only if weather permitted, and lenders now demanded updated collateral schedules before extending patience. Clint took losses on low fields, but his structure shifted the damage from existential to manageable. He prepaid seed with a 4% discount for 1994 delivery, bought distressed fertilizer lots at 18% below spring contract sheets, and secured crop insurance without lender covenants because no bank held his machinery or land paper. His ledger showed annual interest expense in plain columns: $0, $0, $0. Three neighboring operations he tracked for comparison showed $31,800, $44,200, and $52,900. By October 1994, foreclosures were not headlines in Livingston County. They were courthouse routines. Clint attended sales quietly, stood in back, and bid only on parcels adjacent to ground he already managed. Across 3 transactions, he purchased 410 acres at an average of $1,006 per acre. Total $412,460, plus $11,940 in legal and transfer costs, all paid without financing. The county interpreted that as consolidation. His contracts proved otherwise. He offered below-market leasebacks to displaced families at rates ranging from $68 to $82 per acre, when prevailing cash rents sat near $95 to $110, with 5-year purchase options tied to principal-only recovery schedules. He wrote one condition into each agreement: keep taxes current, keep fences maintained, keep books transparent. The objective was continuity, not extraction. Darren Holt was the first to sign one of those leaseback paths in early 1995 on 160 acres. Clint set the principal recovery at $161,000 over 5 years, 0 interest, annual installments pegged to harvest settlement dates rather than calendar quarters. Darren made every payment except one partial during a wet fall. Clint carried the balance into spring without penalties. Marie Bell and Tom Bell entered a separate arrangement in 1996 for 120 acres, principal only at $122,400 with annual tranches of $24,480. Javier Ruiz did not seek land first. He asked for time and pasture access, so Clint structured a grazing and feed agreement worth $18,600 in deferred charges over 3 years to help him rebuild herd footing. Len Parker, who had moved into repair work full-time, leased a shop-adjacent lot from Clint for $1 per year for 7 years on the condition he trained 2 apprentices each season. If you are learning something from this, notice what is happening beneath the emotion. Liquidity is not merely self-protection. In disciplined hands, liquidity becomes local infrastructure when credit systems tighten. From 1995 through 2007, Clint's visible life barely changed. The 1972 Chevrolet kept adding miles, paint fading further across the hood. The Oliver 165, O stayed in field rotation for lighter tillage and planting support, then auger duty during peak grain movement. His clothing remained patched, his household budget moved only with inflation adjustments he documented to the dollar, and his public posture stayed restrained. Yet his financial base widened every year through retained earnings, land productivity gains, conservative reinvestment, and 0 machinery note drag. He added treasury ladders in staggered maturities, kept brokerage exposure weighted toward dividend-paying utility and rail positions, and never borrowed against appreciating land by depreciating equipment. By the second week of August 2008, credit stress had moved from rumor to mechanism again. A regional auction near Chillicothe listed a 600-acre block with strong soils and contiguous access that several operators wanted, but few could close without heavy financing. Wade Kessler was there, older, still pressed and confident, representing buyers who expected term sheets to do the lifting. When Clint's final bid held at $2,460,000, Wade said within earshot of a half-circle crowd that cash farmers were mostly stories, and this sale would prove it at closing. He was not theatrical. He sounded certain. Closing took place 48 hours later in a title office conference room with 6 witnesses, 2 attorneys, and a lender representative for a competing bidder. Clint arrived carrying a plain envelope, not a briefcase. Inside was a certified check for $2,460,000 and a second check covering closing costs, filings, and prorated taxes totaling $73,418. Funds came from matured treasury positions, retained farm earnings, and a conservative brokerage account built over 29 years without margin borrowing. Wade requested bank verification. The issuing institution confirmed both instruments in full. The room stayed quiet long enough to make paper shuffling sound loud. Wade looked at Clint and said, "I was wrong about your math." That was the whole concession. The revelation did not end with that purchase. It sharpened into purpose the same afternoon. Standing outside the office with Darren, Marie, Tom, Javier, and Len nearby for unrelated paperwork, Clint announced a revolving equipment fund capitalized at $900,000, 0 interest, for local operators under 40. Maximum per borrower was $75,000. Terms were fixed, transparent, and strict. Repayment schedules tied to realistic production cycles, mandatory maintenance logs on financed equipment, and one required clause that each borrower mentor one new entrant for at least 2 seasons. No speeches, just structure. Applications opened 30 days later through a 3-person review panel, including Clint, a retired extension accountant, and a local feed mill owner. The first 12 approvals between 2009 and 2012 mapped directly to needs that banks had stopped serving. Borrower 1 replaced a failing planter drive system with a $41,200 used unit and repaid over 4 years. Borrower 2 purchased hay equipment for $33,600 and cleared the note in 38 months. Javier Ruiz took a $48,000 equipment and herd support loan in 2010, rebuilt towards stable calf numbers, and repaid in full on schedule by 2016. Darren Holt used a $72,500 package to stabilize grain handling and transport efficiencies, then transitioned into cooperative management with cleaner books than he had carried in any prior decade. Marie and Tom Bell did not draw from the equipment fund initially. Their principal-only land path remained the priority, and they completed repurchase terms exactly as contracted. Len Parker declined a loan twice, then accepted $24,300 for diagnostic tooling tied to apprentice commitments, repaid over 5 years while expanding his repair shop into a regional service point for older machinery. The deeper arithmetic is what converted county skepticism into consensus. Clint's internal review in 2014 compared 2 30-year pathways beginning in 1979 with the same acreage base and average yield assumptions. Path A, representative finance cycle. Machinery refresh every 7 to 9 years. Blended annual equipment debt service averaging $26,400. Variable interest shocks in 2 crisis windows, and higher insurance and service plan costs. Path B, Clint's cycle, cash equipment purchases, heavier maintenance allocations, larger cash reserves, and opportunistic distressed buying. Over 30 years, Path A generated total machinery-related cash outflow of $1,486,000, of which $612,000 was interest, fees, and finance-linked add-ons. Path B generated $914,000 in machinery and maintenance outflow, with $0 equipment interest. Difference? $572,000. Compounded at a conservative 5% annual return, that spread alone exceeded $1,230,000 by 2008. He ran a second decomposition on land timing. Distressed parcel purchases in 1994 at $1,006 per acre versus equivalent parcels that later traded above $3,900 created embedded equity that exceeded $1,186,000 by 2018 before productivity gains. Leaseback concessions reduced short-term income, yes, but preserved operator continuity, protected soil stewardship, and lowered vacancy and turnover risk that usually follow foreclosure churn. In purely financial terms, his below-market lease rates cost him roughly $148,000 over the first 5 years. In systems terms, they kept families producing and repaying rather than exiting and liquidating. That trade-off was deliberate. By 2016, the revolving fund had issued $1,740,000 in cumulative loans through recycled principal, with a 96.4% on-time payment rate and no predatory penalties because there were no interest charges to weaponize. By 2020, participants who completed the program had mentored 27 additional entrants, 12 of whom later acquired acreage or long-term leases. Collectively, direct recipients and first-generation mentees operated 3,480 acres, managed 1,240 cow-calf pairs, and held equipment debt loads far below county averages. The multiplier effect was no longer philosophical. It was measurable. In county memory, the visual symbol never changed. A rusted old Oliver parked near a leaning shed. A worn truck that looked overdue for retirement. Patched work clothes at auctions where polished boots usually set the tone. Yet when the numbers were finally visible in one frame, the underlying pattern was undeniable. The operator dismissed as small had built one of the strongest balance sheets in the region and then converted that strength into second chances with terms commercial lenders had long since abandoned. The county did not absorb that pattern in one meeting or one harvest, but by the spring sign-up window in 2009, the revolving fund had a waiting list and a rule set that looked more like a stewardship contract than a loan desk. Clint required cash flow worksheets, maintenance plans, and mentor commitments before he approved a dollar. He did not ask for polished presentations. He asked for field records, repair logs, and honest break-even math. That filtered out vanity purchases and kept the fund tied to productive assets. By the end of the first operating cycle, 7 borrowers had drawn $312,400. 6 were current to the day, and 1 requested a weather extension that was granted after documented yield loss. The key outcome was behavioral, not just financial. Younger operators began budgeting for total ownership cost instead of shopping by monthly payment optics. Darren Holt became the clearest long arc recovery. After losing those 640 rented acres years earlier, he entered Clint's equipment program with discipline that came from hard memory. In 2010, he used a $72,500 zero-interest allocation for grain handling upgrades, then added $9,800 of his own cash for electrical and safety compliance. The improvement cut truck wait time, reduced spoilage penalties, and lowered seasonal custom hauling expense by roughly $14,200 per year. He repaid on schedule in 48 months, then accepted a management role at a cooperative grain facility outside Chillicothe, with a base salary of $84,000 and performance incentives tied to shrink reduction. By 2024, he and his wife held no consumer debt, owned their home, and carried retirement accounts totaling $611,000. He still said the same sentence when younger growers asked what changed. "I stopped borrowing against hope." Marie Bell and Tom Bell took the slower path because they prioritized regaining title over expanding scale. Their principal-only leaseback terms on 120 acres were heavy but workable because every payment reduced balance directly. They completed the final transfer, recorded clear title, and then deliberately froze growth for 3 full seasons to rebuild liquidity. In 2013, they borrowed $36,000 from the revolving fund for a used planter and closing wheel retrofit package, repaid in 36 months, and never missed a date. Their average net operating margin improved from 7.8% to 16.9% over the next 6-year span through tighter timing and lower repair volatility. By the second week of October 2024, they still farmed that same 120 acres, plus modest rented ground, and their son handled agronomy records with the same ledger format Clint used. Their balance sheet remained modest by county headline standards and very strong by risk standards. Low fixed obligations, positive working capital, and machinery costs anchored to cash flow rather than status. Javier Ruiz rebuilt through livestock, patience, and one correctly sized loan. His 2010 draw of $48,000 covered handling equipment, pasture improvements, and a targeted herd rebuild plan, not broad expansion. He tied repayment to calf sale cycles, set aside a drought reserve every quarter, and finished payoff in 2016 without extensions. From that point, he grew from recovery mode into stability. 85 cows by 2024, improved conception rates, better feed conversion, and annual debt service near zero outside ordinary vendor float paid within terms. His daughter now manages records and vaccination scheduling, and Javier mentors 2 beginning cattle operators each season under the same clause he once signed. He does not romanticize the turnaround. He calls it arithmetic plus humility. Len Parker converted loss into craft and then into regional utility. His shop lease at $1 per year gave him runway when ownership was no longer an option. He declined help twice, accepted $24,300 for diagnostic equipment on the third offer, and repaid in 5 years while training apprentices every season as promised. By 2024, Parker Repair and Field Service employed 6 full-time technicians, serviced older machinery across 3 counties, and had trained 22 apprentices, 12 of whom stayed in rural mechanical trades. Len never returned land ownership, and he no longer treated that as failure. He built a durable business with steady cash flow, no predatory debt, and respected technical standards. In county terms, he became essential infrastructure. The multiplier effect, tracked rigorously, validated Clint's design. Between 2009 and 2024, the $900,000 fund recycled principal into $2,860,000 in cumulative zero-interest loans. On-time repayments settled at 95.8%. Total charge-offs were limited to $41,700 across weather and health disruptions, absorbed without penalties cascading through families. 41 direct borrowers completed terms. Each mentored at least one new operator, producing 53 documented second-generation entrants. Together, those 2 groups operated 5,120 acres and 1,930 cow-calf pairs by 2024, with average machinery debt far below county benchmarks and stronger liquidity ratios through weak commodity years. One disciplined balance sheet had become a local stabilizer. Wade Kessler's resolution was quieter than his early confidence, and it carried its own lesson. After the 2008 closing, he continued selling financed inventory through changing cycles. But margin pressure and floor plan exposure tightened around his branch as used values softened and delinquency stress climbed. He retired in 2016, still solvent personally, with commission earnings that had been substantial in the high-turn years. In 2018, the dealership branch he had managed closed after overexposure to financed units that could not clear at expected prices without deep losses. Wade did not stage a public apology tour. He did something more practical. He began consulting younger sales staff across the region and changed his opening script from payment first language to full ownership decomposition. Purchase price, interest path sensitivity, service contract load, depreciation curve, and exit value risk. In a 2021 winter training session, he used Clint's 1984 trade quote and rebuild ledger as a case study, and told the room that monthly affordability without cycle resilience was a sales story, not an operating strategy. He and Clint were never close friends, but they were civil. On 2 occasions, Wade sent beginning farmers to Len's shop for lower-cost machinery inspections before purchase. That was as close as the county came to reconciliation, and it was enough. By 2024, Clint Harmon was still in Missouri, still driving the same 1972 Chevrolet C20. Odometer passed 401,000 miles, door bottoms rough with rust, and the bench seat patched again with heavy canvas. The Oliver 165, no longer carried primary tillage loads after 45 harvests, but it still ran auger duty in season and started reliably with routine manifold heat and careful maintenance. Clint's household life remained plain. His annual living draw, inflation-adjusted and documented, was $24,600, including groceries, utilities, clothing, fuel, property upkeep, and giving. No debt, no lifestyle swing. His holdings were large because his outflow stayed disciplined for decades. Owned land valued at $6,412,800, cash equivalents at $1,103,200, conservative brokerage positions at $982,000, and livestock plus equipment net value at $242,000. Total estimated net worth, $8,740,000. Personal debt, $0. Every named life in this county arc had a clear location by then. Darren managed the cooperative and taught risk budgeting workshops each winter. Marie and Tom farmed their repurchased ground and transferred clean records to the next generation. Javier rebuilt his herd and mentored younger cattle operators through dry years. Len ran the repair shop and kept apprentices moving into paid work. Wade retired, saw his branch close, and spent his final professional years teaching total cost of ownership instead of monthly illusion. Clint remained understated, still writing in ledgers, still avoiding borrowed money for depreciating iron, still structuring help with accountability rather than sentiment. By that stage, no one needed a louder narrator to frame the outcome. The evidence sat in courthouse filings, paid notes, shop payrolls, and fields still planted by families who had nearly been priced out of continuation. The county had watched the argument run its full length. The final image stayed ordinary, which was the point. Late light across a Missouri yard. A leaning shed repaired but not replaced. A weathered Oliver humming at the auger. A rusted truck idling nearby. No polished reveal, no grand statement, no revenge scene. Just verified numbers across 45 years showing that the man judged poorest in public had the strongest private foundation, and that foundation did not end with him. It circulated through neighbors, families, apprentices, and fields that stayed in production because one farmer chose resilience over display, then turned that resilience into second chances that were priced fairly, documented clearly, and paid forward. On a cold Monday in December 2024, the revolving fund board met at the same feed mill office where Clint had signed the first approval stack in 2009, and the room smelled like coffee, dust, and binder paper warmed by an old wall heater. Clint carried two ledgers under his arm, one black, one green. The black book held farm entries. The green book held every fund note, every payment date, every extension request, and every mentor assignment. He set both on the table, took off his cap, and said, "Let us close the year clean." Darren Holt arrived first, now in a cooperative jacket instead of chore coveralls. Though his hands still looked like a man who fixed his own augers, he slid in a printed statement from the grain facility he managed. Annual throughput up 11.3%, spoilage losses down from 1.8% to 0.9%, net operating surplus $412,000 after reserve allocations. He was there for more than reporting. He was sponsoring a 26-year-old operator for a $54,700 used planter and variable rate retrofit package, and he had already co-signed the mentorship hours. Clint read the cash flow sheet, checked projected debt service coverage under low-price assumptions, then asked one question. "What is your break-even at 130 bushels?" Darren answered without looking down. "Positive by 14,000 after repairs." Clint nodded once and signed. Marie Bell and Tom Bell came in together with a brown envelope of property tax receipts and their son's digital-to-paper printout of 5 years of field margins. The old leaseback file from 1996 sat clipped to the top, stamped, paid, and closed. Their 120 acres had remained in the family, and in 2024, they finished tile work on the wet corner that had cut yields for decades. Total project cost was $38,200. They paid $22,000 cash and requested $16,200 from the fund to preserve operating liquidity. Tom spoke softly, as always. "We could pay full. We do not want to get thin before spring." Clint said, "That is the correct reason to borrow." The board approved it at 0 interest, 36 months, with their son assigned to mentor a beginning row crop tenant north of Wheeling. Javier Ruiz arrived late because he had loaded hay at daylight, hat brim still carrying chaff. He was not there for money. He was there to close his mentorship file for 2 cattle starters who had completed their second season, with no missed feed bills and no late pasture rent. Javier had rebuilt to 85 cows years earlier and then held steady, refusing pressure to double. In his folder, he carried weight records, conception rates, mineral costs, and a handwritten drought plan with trigger points tied to pasture condition rather than hope. Clint reviewed the pages and said, "You rebuilt it right." Javier smiled, tired and proud at the same time. "Slow enough to sleep." Len Parker came in with grease under his nails and an apprentice beside him who still looked surprised to be in the room. Len's shop had grown to 6 technicians, but he still charged diagnostic time fairly and wrote parts estimates in plain language. His annual report showed $1,184,000 in gross shop revenue, payroll of $412,000, and 0 term debt after he paid off an expansion bay in 2023. He had not missed his training obligation once. 22 apprentices through the program, 12 retained in rural trades, 4 now running mobile service routes of their own. He set down a photo of the first diagnostic tool cart he bought with Clint's $24,300 loan, paint chipped, drawers still straight. "Still work, he said. Clint tapped the photo once and replied, "Paid for tools work longer." By the second week of January 2025, the board's audited totals were posted at the county library and the extension office, so nobody had to trust rumor. Since launch, the $900,000 seed capital had revolved into $3,104,700 in cumulative zero-interest loans, on-time repayment rate 95.6%, restructured weather extensions 17, permanent charge-offs $49,200, each documented and voted. None turned into predatory penalties. Direct borrowers completed 44. Verified second-generation mentees still operating after 3 years 57. Combined footprint 5,460 acres and 2,040 cow-calf pairs. Average machinery debt per participating operation sat 43% below the county comparison group. It was not charity as sentiment. It was discipline shared. Wade Kessler's final chapter closed in public, not dramatic, but clear. In February 2025, at a winter's sales seminar in Brookfield, he stood at a projector screen as a retired manager invited back to teach risk decomposition to younger staff. He wore the same polished style, but his opening line had changed. If you sell payment without cycle stress testing, you are selling trouble. On the second slide, he showed the 1984 trade quote he had once pushed across a counter to Clint. $172,400 list, 13.2% variable, 84 payments of $2,214. On the third slide, he showed Clint's rebuild ledger line. $1,840 total overhaul cost that season. Wade did the arithmetic in front of 80 trainees, including insurance load, service plan assumptions, and historical rate sensitivity. The finance path, under realistic shocks, crossed $230,000 in total outflow. The rebuild path plus disciplined reserve investing preserved optionality that later purchased land and funded other operators. After the session, one trainee asked if the story embarrassed him. Wade paused, then answered, "It corrected me. That is better." He stepped away from occasional training sessions that spring, and his advice remained consistent until he stopped altogether. Quote, "Total cost, show downside cases, and do not confuse new paint with solvency." He never became a different personality. He became a more careful one. That was his resolution. In March 2025, Wade drove out to Clint's place in a used half-ton with plain plates, no logo. The leaning shed had been straightened years earlier, but not replaced. The Oliver 165. O sat by the auger, paint still faded, manifold heater wire neatly clipped, seat recovered in dark vinyl by Len's shop after the old crack widened. Clint was checking a belt guard when Wade walked up. They stood shoulder to shoulder for a moment, looking at the same machine they had argued about for 4 decades. Wade said, "You still run it." Clint answered, "Light duty. Earned retirement." Wade handed him a folder with copies of his seminar slides and said, "I teach this now." Clint looked at the first page, then closed it and handed it back. "Good. Teach the whole cost." They shook hands once. No audience, no speech. Thread closed. Clint's own records were closed with the same plain method. In April 2025, he met with a county archivist and donated duplicate copies of non-private ledgers from 1979 through 2010, including the original folded 1984 Expo quote with Wade's financing terms, his pencil margin note beneath it, and annual summaries that tracked retained earnings, repair costs, and zero machinery interest across decades. The archivist asked why he was giving away documents most people would lock up. Clint said, "Because memory drifts. Numbers do not." The private book stayed with family trustees. The public books became a local teaching file for beginning operators. Every named life in this story had a present tense place. Darren Holt still managed the cooperative and taught winter budgeting nights. Marie and Tom Bell still farmed their 120 acres and had begun gradual transition planning with their son under a no-consumer debt rule. Javier Ruiz still ran 85 cows, still mentored, still kept drought triggers on paper by the kitchen calendar. Len Parker still ran the repair shop, still trained apprentices, still answered emergency calls before dawn in calving season. Wade Kessler stayed retired and was remembered, finally, less for sales pressure than for his late career insistence on full-cost honesty. Clint Harmon still lived in Missouri, still drove the 1972 Chevrolet C20 past 400 to 1,000 miles, still kept household draw restrained, still carried no personal debt, and still treated liquidity as responsibility, not status. If you want more stories where arithmetic beats appearances, subscribe now and stay with this series. If you have ever faced the choice between a bigger payment and a smaller risk, write in the comments what number decided it for you. Share this with one person who is being judged by what they drive instead of what they can sustain. At sunset that evening, the truck idled beside the auger with its old window crank squeaking when Clint rolled it down. The hand-painted fare number on the door was faint but visible. The heater fan still clicked on high. The Oliver turned steady on light load, metal warm, exhaust thin in the cooling air. Nothing about the yard looked rich. That was the final proof. The county had spent 45 years watching rust and mistaking it for weakness, while the real asset was hidden in ledgers, restraint, and promises kept on exact dates. The tractor they called Scrap outlasted financed fleets, the man they called Poor Financed Recoveries, and the rule written every January, plain block letters on lined paper, still held, no borrowed money for depreciating iron.